They ruined her dress at the season's most exclusive gala, turning her into a spectacle for the crowd. What no one knew, the Vampire King had been watching her all evening, waiting for a reason to approach without breaking ancient protocol. He wrapped his jacket around her trembling shoulders and led her past the whispers. But the act of public protection just activated a centuries-old marriage law neither of them can escape. The cold wine soaked through ivory silk in seconds, spreading like blood across snow, and Alara Moss stood frozen in the center of the Grand Celestine ballroom while 200 phones rose in perfect synchronization, 200 eyes bearing witness to her destruction. She was a museum curator invited only because her institution had loaned artifacts for the exhibition, a placeholder among the glittering elite, and Victoria Ashford had just made certain everyone in attendance understood exactly where Alara belonged. The weight of silence pressed against her eardrums before the whispers began, a rustling sound like dead leaves, and the crystal chandeliers overhead fractured into 1,000 judging eyes, each facet reflecting her humiliation in miniature. Her hands trembled as she calculated escape routes, measuring distances to doorways, counting bodies between her and freedom, her mind cataloging exits the way it cataloged artifacts, because that was what she did when panic threatened to overwhelm her. 3 years ago, she had exposed the Ashford family collection as stolen grave goods, meticulously documented proof that their fortune was built on plundered history, and her academic career had collapsed under the weight of their retaliation. Lawyers and influence wielded like weapons until her name became synonymous with troublemaker, unreliable, obsessed. Tonight was payback. Victoria orchestrating this accident with surgical precision, the stumble perfectly timed, the wineglass angled just right, the performance flawless. Movement rippled through the crowd, and a jacket settled over Alara's shoulders, silk lining still warm against her frozen skin, smelling of winter rain and old paper, a scent that didn't belong in this perfumed ballroom. Lucian Vale's hand, steady and careful, guided her toward the terrace, his touch light against her elbow, and his voice came low, meant only for her ears. I already did. She didn't understand the words, didn't understand why this stranger was helping her, but she moved with him because standing still meant drowning in humiliation, and at least movement felt like survival. As they passed a gilded mirror, Alara caught their reflection, saw herself wrapped in his jacket, saw him beside her, except his reflection appeared delayed, an echo rather than a simultaneous image, present but half a second behind reality. In the corner of her vision, a council observer reached for his phone, fingers moving with sudden urgency, and something in the quality of the air shifted, a door opening that couldn't be closed. The winter garden terrace spread before them, bare silver trees catching moonlight, the gala muffled behind thick glass like a film playing on silent. Alara's breath clouded white in the cold air while Lucian's did not, and that detail registered in her cataloging mind, filed away under observations that didn't make sense. A woman emerged from the shadows between the trees, moving with predatory grace, her expression furious and precise. You gave her your jacket, she said without preamble, each word clipped and sharp. In public. Before witnesses from 3 houses. The right of shielding. You invoked it. Alara's mind caught on the unfamiliar terms, trying to organize information the way she organized historical data, seeking patterns and context. The woman, Sienna Cross, explained in angry phrases that fragmented and reformed. Ancient marriage law, protection contract that auto-escalated unless dissolved, council convening within 72 hours. Possible outcomes arrived like hammer blows. Validate the bond, marriage required within 30 days. Dissolution with proof the human was unworthy, which would justify her public humiliation, make it official and legal. Sanction for law manipulation, which meant execution. Alara processed this the way she processed hostile academic boards, breaking down the problem into manageable questions. Why would a law designed to protect turn into a trap? Why was Sienna angry at Lucian instead of her? Lucian spoke for the first time since they'd left the ballroom, his voice carrying centuries of weight. The law is old, older than the covenant. It wasn't meant to be used, but it's binding once invoked. Through the terrace glass, Elara could see Victoria laughing, phone still recording, capturing every moment for posterity and social media. She looked at Lucian, this stranger who had stepped between her and humiliation without knowing her name, without understanding what it would cost him. "What do I have to do?" she asked, and his expression shifted, relief and something darker moving beneath the surface. "Survive the next 3 days." Headlights appeared in the distance, a black sedan moving too deliberately down the curved drive, and Sienna's hand disappeared beneath her jacket, finding a concealed weapon with practiced ease. The brownstone library was not his public estate, Lucian explained as they climbed worn stone steps, but his private archive, a place few people knew existed. Fire burned in the hearth without wood, flames dancing on air and mathematics, and books in dead languages lined every wall from floor to ceiling, leather spines cracked with age and careful preservation. Elara, still wrapped in his jacket because she couldn't seem to let it go, ran her fingers along the shelves, her researcher instincts overriding fear when she recognized a manuscript thought lost in 1347, a treatise on preservation techniques that historians believed had burned. "This shouldn't exist," she breathed, and Lucian's response came quiet and honest. "Most of my life shouldn't exist." They stood in the firelight, two people who didn't belong in each other's worlds, and the vulnerability exchange began without ceremony. He was 340 years old, had been vampire king for a century and a half, had never invoked the right of shielding because it required something he thought he'd lost, the instinct to protect without political calculation, without weighing consequences and outcomes. She told him about the Ashfords, how she'd discovered their fortune built on plundered grave goods, how they'd destroyed her career with methodical precision, how she had evidence but no platform, no credibility, no way to make the truth matter. Sienna arrived with intelligence, her anger cooled to professional efficiency. The council hearing had been moved up, tomorrow at dusk instead of 72 hours, someone applying pressure to accelerate the process. Magistrate Orrin Cross would preside, neutral but rigid, a literalist who interpreted law without mercy or flexibility. A messenger delivered a formal challenge while Sienna briefed them, the envelope sealed with crimson wax. House Thorne had filed an interference claim, arguing that Lucian staged the wine incident to trap a human and gain political leverage, that the entire scene was manufactured for his benefit. Elara fell asleep in a wingback chair without meaning to, exhaustion overwhelming adrenaline, his jacket still around her shoulders like armor. Lucian watched her from across the room, something ancient and careful in his expression. A man who had lived centuries suddenly uncertain, the weight of his decisions settling over him like snow. Dawn crept through leaded windows and Elara woke to find breakfast arranged on a side table, a tailored charcoal suit laid across the chair arm in exactly her size. The note tucked into the jacket pocket read, "Dress for war, not mercy," signed with Sienna's angular script. The Gala incident had gone viral overnight, footage spreading across every platform, #Vampire King Mystery, trending in 17 countries. Elara forced herself to watch the coverage, to see how the narrative had been weaponized. Victoria Ashford gave a tearful interview, claiming Elara had thrown herself at Lucian, orchestrated the scene for attention and vampire protection, painted herself as the real victim of an obsessive curator's manipulations. Public opinion turned with brutal efficiency. Elara was a gold digger, a manipulator, a human trying to trap a king, and the comment section overflowed with speculation and judgment. The council would see this coverage, Sienna warned, scandal influencing their rulings whether they admitted it or not. Lucian stood by the window, dawn light catching in his dark hair, and Alara found herself asking the question that had haunted her since the terrace. Why didn't you just let me leave? He was silent for a long moment, something working. In his expression, some internal calculation or confession. Because I've watched power destroy the defenseless for 3 centuries. I'm tired of watching. She heard what he didn't say, the subtext clear in his tone and posture. I'm tired of being complicit through inaction. Sienna returned with new intelligence, her expression grim. House Thorne had bribed Victoria Ashford £200,000 to target Alara specifically at the gala, had observed Lucian at the museum twice, and identified his interest, wanted to force him into an untenable position. This wasn't about Alara at all, not really, just a political move against Lucian's rule, a way to destabilize his authority by trapping him in an impossible choice. A brick crashed through the window in a shower of glass, wrapped in a note that read, "Humans don't belong in our world. Withdraw or burn." Lucian picked up the brick, read the note, his expression unchanging, but the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees in 3 seconds, frost forming on the windowsill and creeping across the floor. Alara saw, for the first time, the king beneath the careful control, the ancient power he kept leashed and hidden, the thing that made him dangerous when he chose to be. And something in her chest tightened with understanding that this man had just declared war to protect her. A stranger, he didn't owe anything, except perhaps the recognition that she'd been right about the Ashfords. That truth mattered, even when it cost everything. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The deep archive past wards that hummed against Alara's skin like static electricity felt older than the building itself. Walls carved from stone that predated modern construction, air thick with preservation magic and centuries of accumulated knowledge. Lucian showed her the original Rite of Shielding text, handwritten in 1483 on vellum that had survived 500 years through careful protection, ink still dark and legible despite the passage of time. The law was created after a plague that decimated human populations across Europe, families seeking vampire protection in exchange for service, and the marriage clause ensured permanent safety rather than servitude, a refugee protection designed to prevent exploitation when humans were most vulnerable. Lucian's confession came slowly, words chosen with the care of someone who had spent decades analyzing his own history. His maker, the previous vampire king, had abused the right to claim humans as trophies, collecting them like rare books or precious artifacts, and Lucian had killed him for it 150 years ago, spent decades afterward rewriting covenant laws to prevent such abuses. But he couldn't erase the ancient rites without full council approval, which he had never achieved, because too many old houses clung to the old ways, to the power dynamics that favored them, to traditions that predated morality. Alara understood now with the clarity that came from seeing all the pieces laid out like evidence in a case file. Lucian wasn't trapping her, wasn't using the law for his own gain. She was his vulnerability made manifest. If she refused the bond, his enemies would claim he invoked outdated law recklessly, destabilizing council precedent for personal whim. If she accepted under duress, they would say he coerced her, that his protection was really exploitation wearing a different mask. Either way, he was exposed, weakened, his authority compromised. "You saved me and damned yourself," she said. The words, simple statement of fact rather than accusation. "I'd do it again." No hesitation in his voice, only certainty that ran deeper than strategy or calculation. Alara chose to fight in that moment, not just survive the hearing, but use it as a platform, expose House Thorne's manipulation and the Ashfords' crimes, force the council to modernize or abolish the right entirely, because outdated laws became weapons in the hands of people willing to wield them without conscience. As he helped her research the law's historical applications and precedents, their hands brushed over a manuscript page, fingers touching accidentally but neither pulling away immediately, the awareness between them electric and careful. Neither acknowledged it directly because the moment was too fragile, too complicated by circumstance and survival, but something shifted in the space between them, recognition passing unspoken. Sienna drilled Alara on vampire etiquette with military precision, teaching her how to address the magistrate with proper titles and formal phrasing, where to stand in the chamber to show respect without submission, which historical lineages carried weight in council politics, because every gesture was language in this world, every movement read for meaning and intent. Alara refused the demure dress Sienna suggested, a soft gray thing designed to make her look harmless and deferential. She wore the tailored suit instead, charcoal fabric sharp and unyielding, projecting authority rather than submission, because she would not walk into that chamber asking for mercy. Lucian contacted Lady Mirren Hale, a neutral council member who had survived her own forced bonding centuries ago and spent the intervening years quietly advocating for human protections within vampire law. She agreed to attend, but warned them in a voice that carried the weight of hard-won experience. The law is a blade. Wield it or fall on it. Don't confuse the two. Before they left the archive, Lucian handed Alara a glass dagger, ceremonial in appearance but real in function, capable of cutting vampire flesh despite their enhanced durability, the blade catching firelight like frozen water. If the council rules against you, this can end me. Use it if you have to. She closed her fingers around the hilt, felt the weight settle in her palm, met his eyes directly. I won't need to. His slight smile carried something that might have been pride, or relief, or recognition. I know. Council Hall spread beneath the city like an underground cathedral. Cold fire lighting stone corridors and silver archways. Ancient sigils carved into every surface in languages that predated written history. Observers filled the galleries in tiers rising toward vaulted ceilings, witness to proceedings that would set precedent for decades. House Thorne's delegation sat front row, Dominic Thorne's smile sharp as cut glass, confident in his position and his strategy. Alara's hands were steady as she entered, her heartbeat loud in her own ears, but her expression calm. She had presented evidence to hostile academic boards before, faced rooms full of people determined to dismiss her research and discredit her findings. This was just another arena where truth fought power, another battle she refused to lose. Magistrate Cross entered through carved doors that swung open without sound, gray-haired and stone-faced, impossibly old even by vampire standards, carrying authority like a physical weight. His gaze swept the room with methodical precision and landed on Alara, held for 3 seconds of absolute assessment. Then his voice rang out, formal and final. We convene. Dominic Thorne's advocate opened with arguments polished smooth by legal expertise, claiming Lucian had orchestrated the humiliation to bypass the protocol of approach, presenting photos of Lucian at the museum on 2 separate occasions, donation records showing his financial support of Alara's institution, timeline analysis suggesting premeditation and planning. The Vampire King staged a public spectacle to justify invoking an outdated law he could twist to his advantage, to claim a human without following proper channels, to circumvent restrictions placed on his power. Sienna's defense came cool and surgical, dismantling the timeline with precision that left no room for speculation. Lucian could not have predicted Victoria Ashford's exact timing, could not have controlled her decision to humiliate Alara at that specific moment, in that specific way. The right was invoked in genuine response to genuine threat, protection offered in the only way available under the circumstances. Alara was called to the chamber center, stone floor cold through her shoes despite the fires burning in iron braziers along the walls, every eye in the galleries fixed on her with varying degrees of curiosity and judgment. Cross spoke with formal precision, each word weighted for the record. Did you consent to the right of shielding? Alara kept her voice steady, her answer honest. I didn't understand the law at the time, but I understood his intent to protect me when no one else would. And if this bond is validated, you accept marriage to the Vampire King? The pause stretched, long enough for her pulse to become visible in her throat, long enough for doubt to creep through the galleries. I accept the chance to stand here and ask you this. Why does a law meant to protect humans become a weapon the moment it's used as intended? Absolute silence filled the chamber, heavy and complete. Lady Mirren Hale leaned forward in her seat, ghost of approval flickering across her ancient features. Dominic's countermove came swift and brutal. Video testimony from Victoria Ashford claiming Alara had stalked Lucian for months, that the wine incident was fabricated collaboration, that she was a gold digger using historical research as cover for social climbing and manipulation. Alara's evidence drop landed like an explosion, financial records showing House Thorne had paid Victoria £200,000 3 days before the gala, her own research documenting the Ashford family's looted antiquities and tying them to illegal trade networks spanning decades in multiple countries. This hearing isn't about me or the right. It's about eliminating a human who knows too much and discrediting a king who refused to be complicit in your corruption. The galleries erupted in chaos, voices rising in shock and argument, and Magistrate Cross's gavel rang like a gunshot, order barely restored through sheer force of authority. Dominic pivoted smoothly, turning her evidence into weapon against her. The evidence proves Alara Moss is dangerous, a human weaponizing secrets as blackmail, exactly the kind of manipulator the right was never meant to protect. Cross announced deliberation until tomorrow night, declared that Lucian and Alara would be confined to separate quarters in the hall until the ruling was delivered. Before guards led her away, Lucian caught her hand, his skin cool against hers, which burned with adrenaline and exhaustion. Whatever they rule, she started, but she cut herself off, met his eyes instead. We're not done fighting. His thumb brushed across her knuckles, brief and deliberate, a gesture that said everything words couldn't. Then the guard stepped between them, and she was gone. The gilded cage they gave her was luxurious and windowless, expensive furnishings arranged in a space designed for comfort and imprisonment in equal measure. Alara paced, replaying every word and every argument, analyzing what had landed and what had failed, calculating next moves like chess positions on an invisible board. Lady Mirren arrived unannounced, moving like smoke through shadows, appearing without sound or warning. You argued brilliantly, she said without preamble. But Cross is a literalist. He'll validate the bond if law supports it, regardless of morality or intent. Then we've won, Alara replied. But Mirren's expression carried warning that killed the small surge of hope. No. Because Dominic Thorne has invoked the trial of worth, ancient law that predates the covenant itself. 3 trials testing courage and truth and will. If Cross validates the bond, Thorne can challenge it by testing you directly, and most humans don't survive the first trial. The trap's next layer revealed itself with brutal clarity, validation not an ending but an invitation for enemies to destroy her legally, using traditions older and more violent than modern council proceedings. In his quarters across the hall, Sienna briefed Lucian on the trial of worth, a challenge that hadn't been invoked in over a century, designed for vampire disputes where both parties possessed supernatural durability and strength, lethal for humans who lacked those protections. You can refuse on her behalf, Sienna said carefully. Withdraw the right, compensate her financially, end this before it becomes execution disguised as law. She won't want me to, Lucian replied, and Sienna's expression showed she already knew this. I know. That's why you should. Silence stretched between them until Lucian spoke again, voice carrying absolute conviction. She's not a child to be protected from her own choices. At midnight, a note slipped under Alara's door, Lady Mirren's angular handwriting delivering a message that was half warning and half advice. The first trial is fire. don't burn. Cross delivered his ruling at dawn with formal precision, declaring the bond validated as legal and binding under ancient right, 30 days granted to formalize marriage or dissolve by mutual consent. But Dominic Thorne immediately invoked the trial of worth and Cross, could not refuse without undermining the very law structure he existed to uphold. The trials were explained in clinical detail. Trial of fire testing courage through manifestation of deepest fear. Trial of glass testing truth through interrogation that stripped all deception. Trial of blood testing will through suffering without breaking. The chamber gasped when Alara spoke, her voice cutting through the whispers and speculation. I've already survived being humiliated in front of 200 cameras. I'll survive this. The first trial would begin in 1 hour, barely enough time to prepare, designed to prevent strategy or mental fortification, meant to catch the challenger raw and uncertain. The subchamber spread circular and mirror-lined, walls reflecting infinite versions of the space and the observers behind warded glass, who watched with varying expressions of anticipation and unease. Lucian's face pressed against the barrier with expression carefully blank, despite the tension visible in his shoulders and hands. Alara was bound to a chair in the chamber's center, silver restraints holding her wrists and ankles not tight enough to hurt, but secure enough to prevent movement. And the fire they spoke of was not literal flame, but psychological assault, vampire glamour projecting her deepest fear made tangible and inescapable. The academic hearing where she had been discredited materialized around her with brutal clarity, colleagues' faces twisted with contempt and dismissal, her evidence scattered across a table and dismissed as conspiracy theory and academic fraud, her career burning in real time as her reputation crumbled. But this time, actual flames consumed the room in her vision, her research curling black and turning to ash, her sense of self dissolving as fire climbed the walls and ceiling, heat pressing against her skin, though the chamber remained cool. The test required her to speak a truth aloud to break the illusion, simple instruction that became impossibly difficult when fear locked throat and mind, when most victims froze or lied to escape pain that felt real even when it wasn't. Alara shook in the chair, sweat soaking through her suit, flames climbing higher in her vision until they blocked out everything except the consuming certainty of failure. She saw Lucian through the glass for one moment, his face helpless for the first time since she had met him, unable to intervene or protect or change what was happening. Her voice cracked when she finally spoke, forced the words past terror and doubt. I was right. I've always been right. And I'm not afraid of being alone in that. The flames vanished instantly, heat disappearing like it had never existed, and the mirrors cracked in sequence all around the chamber, spiderwebbing outward from her position at the center, fractures spreading through reflective surfaces until the room looked shattered. She had passed the first trial, and 5 minutes of recess were called. Lucian allowed into the chamber immediately, crossing the space in seconds to kneel before her chair. His hands hovered near hers but didn't touch, aware she might not want contact after what the glamour had forced her to experience, aware that comfort could feel like intrusion. You don't have to continue, he said quietly, and she knew he meant it, knew he would find another way if she chose to stop. Yes, I do, she replied, voice still rough from shouting truth into fire. Because if I stop, every human after me faces this same trap. Something in his expression broke and reformed in that moment. Respect becoming something deeper and more complicated. Recognition of courage that went beyond survival instinct into deliberate choice. The chamber reconfigured itself for the trial of glass. Mechanisms hidden in floor and ceiling rearranging the space, while Alara waited in an antechamber barely large enough to stand. Sienna standing guard outside with expression carefully neutral. When she returned to the chamber, she found herself surrounded by a circle of suspended glass shards, each one reflecting a different observer from the galleries, faces watching from impossible angles through fragmented mirrors. The mechanism was interrogation by Magistrate Cross and two council members chosen for their ability to detect deception, every lie shattering a shard until all broke and the floor opened beneath. Symbolic rather than lethal because vampires would catch the victim before impact, but the humiliation would be total and public. The first question came from Cross with formal precision. Did you know who Lucian Vale was before the gala? Alara answered with simple truth. Yes. The shard nearest her pulsed once and held steady, no fractures appearing in the glass. Did you engineer the wine incident? Her answer came just as clear. No. The shard steadied after a moment of uncertainty, Glamour reading her intent and finding no deception. The third question hung in the air like suspended blade before Cross spoke it aloud. Do you love the Vampire King? Alara's pulse became visible in her throat, every eye in the chamber fixed on her face, watching for micro-expressions that would betray emotion or calculation. She met Lucian's gaze through the glass barrier, held it for 3 seconds before answering. I don't know him well enough to love him, but I respect what he did, and I believe he's worth fighting for. The truth was complex and layered, not the simple yes or no they had expected, but it was truth nonetheless, and the shards recognized it as such, holding without fracture or weakness. The final question came from Lady Mirren Hale, her voice carrying weight of centuries and personal experience. If you survive and marry him, will you use that power for revenge? Elara turned to meet her eyes directly, understanding the real question beneath the words, the concern about what kind of queen a wounded human might become. I'll use it for exposure. There's a difference. The last shard glowed white-hot for a moment, testing the truth against intent, then settled into cool transparency. She had passed the second trial, and even Dominic Thorne looked unsettled from his position in the galleries. This human surviving tests, designed to break vampire resolve, enduring what she shouldn't be capable of enduring. Sienna escorted Alara to a private room during the recovery hour, bringing water and medical supplies, checking the minor burns on her wrists where the restraints had heated during the first trial's psychological assault. The trial of blood is worse, Sienna said without preamble, her usual professional distance cracking slightly. It's not about answers or truth, it's about endurance. How bad? Alara asked, and Sienna looked away toward the stone wall, expression closing. Bad enough that I failed it 300 years ago. The chamber for the trial of blood had been stripped completely bare, nothing but stone and a chair and silver chains laid out on a tray, the metal enchanted and toxic to humans through prolonged contact, designed to cause pain without permanent damage. Magistrate Cross looked uncomfortable with the tradition despite his literalist adherence to law, and he modified the trial using his authority as adjudicator. Alara must hold the chains while reciting the oath of binding, the ancient marriage vow in a dead language she would be taught phonetically, words she had never heard before this moment. The chains would heat progressively, and most humans dropped them within 2 minutes. Unable to endure the building pain, she needed to hold for 5 minutes and complete the vow without error, or she would fail all 3 trials despite passing the first 2. Lucian invoked right of substitution before the trial began, ancient law allowing him to take her place if she consented to the exchange. Cross acknowledged the legality, but explained the consequence. Allowed by law. But the bond voids if you do. You cannot shield someone then suffer their trials. The logic collapses. Alara refused before Lucian could argue further. I didn't come this far to let someone else finish it. The chains were placed in her hands with ceremony, cold metal that felt harmless for the first 30 seconds, while a council member began teaching her the vow syllable by syllable, ancient words in a language that predated modern vampiric dialects. Sanguis et umbra, cor et voluntas, she repeated carefully. Blood and shadow, heart and will, the opening words of a binding that would tie her life to Lucian's in ways the rite of shielding had only begun. At 1 minute the chains warmed in her grip, heat spreading through metal that began to feel uncomfortable but not yet painful. At 2 minutes, pain began in earnest, manageable but present, her focus splitting between memorizing unfamiliar syllables and controlling her body's instinct to drop what was hurting her. At 3 minutes, blisters formed across her palms, where skin pressed directly against heating metal, and she stumbled over a syllable, had to restart the entire vow from the beginning according to trial rules, losing 30 seconds of progress. At 4 minutes, tears streamed down her face, but she made no sound, jaw locked against screaming, every breath controlled and deliberate. At 4 minutes 30 seconds, Lucian's hands were claws against the glass barrier, his careful control fracturing as he watched her suffer, as he remained helpless behind wards designed to prevent interference. The final 30 seconds stretched eternal, each syllable of the vow requiring concentration she barely possessed, pain radiating up her arms and into her shoulders, her entire world narrowing to the words she had to speak, and the chains she refused to drop. At 5 minutes exactly, she spoke the last words of the oath of binding, voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough for the council member to verify accuracy. The chains went dark instantly, heat vanishing as enchantment released, and she dropped them onto the stone floor where they clattered loud in the sudden silence. She collapsed forward in the chair, caught by restraints that had been loosened in preparation, and passed the third trial. First human in recorded history to survive all 3 trials of worth, to endure tests designed for vampire resilience, to prove courage and truth and will against systematic attempt to break her. Dominic Thorne stood abruptly from his seat in the galleries, no words spoken, but his expression promising this wasn't over. That, survival of the trials was only one battle in a longer war. He left the chamber with his delegation following, their exit marked by whispers spreading through the remaining observers. Magistrate Cross declared the trials complete and the bond validated beyond any legal challenge, 30 days granted for marriage formalization, and dismissed the assembly with formal precision. Lucian was through the door before it fully opened, crossing to where Alara sat slumped in the chair, her hands blistered and shaking, her face pale with shock and pain and exhaustion. He knelt before her again, as he had after the first trial, but this time he carefully gathered her damaged hands in his own, his touch gentle despite the claws, his expression showing everything his careful control usually hid. Sienna appeared with medical supplies and began treating the burns with efficiency, born of centuries of practice, wrapping Alara's hands in gauze soaked with healing solution that would prevent infection and accelerate recovery. Lady Mirren Hale approached slowly, her ancient face showing rare approval mixed with concern. "You have won today," she said quietly, "but you have also painted a target on yourself that every traditional house will see. They will not forgive a human for surviving what vampires have failed." Alara met her eyes despite the exhaustion weighing on every word. "Then they'll have to get used to disappointment." Mirren's smile was brief and sharp. "Perhaps you will make a good queen after all." The council hall's medical wing received Alara with cold efficiency, healers working on her hands and checking for deeper damage from the trials, psychological as well as physical. Lucian remained present despite protocol suggesting he should leave, standing against the wall where he could see her but stay out of the healer's way, his expression unreadable, but his attention absolute. When the healers finally left them alone for recovery rest, silence stretched between them for a long moment before Alara spoke. "Did you know the trials would be that bad?" He didn't lie to her. "I knew they would try to break you. I didn't know if you could survive them." She looked at her bandaged hands, flexed fingers carefully to test the damage. "But you let me try anyway, because you asked me to trust your choices," he replied simply. "And I do." The medical chamber where Alara recovered felt sterile and cold, despite the fire burning in the corner hearth. Walls white stone and silver fixtures designed for vampire physiology rather than human comfort. Her hands were wrapped in silver-threaded bandages soaked with vampire healing salve, rare and expensive substance that accelerated tissue repair but required careful application to avoid toxicity in human systems. Lucian sat beside her bed in silence, the rage barely contained beneath his careful control visible in the tension of his shoulders and the way his fingers gripped the chair's armrest hard enough to leave marks in the wood. "This ends now," he said finally, voice low and dangerous. "I'll challenge Thorn directly. Blood duel." Alara turned to look at him despite the exhaustion weighing on every movement. "No, that's what he wants. To provoke you into breaking your own reforms, into becoming the violent king the old houses remember, instead of the reformer you've spent a century becoming." Sienna entered before Lucian could argue further, carrying tablet and expression that suggested news too important to wait for formal visiting hours. While the trials were underway, her team had leaked the Ashford evidence to three major news outlets, financial records and antiquities documentation hitting investigative journalists who had been tracking illegal trade networks for years. The story broke across evening news and morning papers simultaneously, prominent family exposed in illegal antiquities trade, bribed by Vampire House to silence whistleblower who had uncovered decades of systematic theft and fraud. The media narrative reversed with brutal speed. Alara no longer portrayed as gold digger or social climber, but as researcher who had exposed corruption and survived trials designed to silence her. Public opinion swinging hard towards sympathy and outrage. Magistrate Cross recalled both parties to emergency council session, the public exposure forcing action because the council could not appear complicit in silencing a human whistleblower without violating covenant human relations treaties that protected researchers and journalists from supernatural interference. Cross delivered his final ruling with expressions suggesting personal distaste for the politics that had forced his hand, but absolute commitment to legal precedent. The right of shielding was validated permanently with no further challenge permitted. Alara Moss granted full legal protection under House Vale, with all rights and privileges that entailed. House Thorn fined substantial sum and censured for bribery and trial protocol abuse. And Trial of Worth, suspended pending council review with strong likelihood of permanent abolition. Dominic Thorne left the chamber without speaking, but his parting glance at Alara carried promise that transcended legal defeat. Silent communication that this battle was over, but the war continued. The validated right required public appearance together at formal covenant event within 72 hours. Tradition designed to demonstrate the bond's legitimacy and the protected human's willing participation. They chose the museum Gala, Alara's world and her terms, returning to the space where everything had begun, but with positions reversed and power balanced differently. Preparation took place in Alara's temporary quarters at House Vale's main residence, her hands still bandaged though healing rapidly, wearing midnight blue gown that was high-necked and elegant without being submissive, projecting authority she had earned through survival. Lucian offered her House Vale's formal coat silver-lined and bearing the family crest in subtle embroidery, symbol of protection and belonging that carried weight in vampire society. "I can't accept this yet," Alara said carefully, understanding the significance, but not ready to claim it fully. "Then borrow it," Lucian replied with slight smile. Again. The gala filled the museum's main hall with mixed crowd, human elites who funded collections and vampire dignitaries who attended out of political necessity or genuine interest, cameras flashing as Alara and Lucian entered together through doors that had witnessed her humiliation weeks before. Victoria Ashford was conspicuously absent, currently under investigation by both human authorities and Vampire Council enforcement, her social position crumbling as rapidly as the lies she had told. Alara's speech was brief and graceful, thanking the museum's board and acknowledging unexpected allies without naming Lucian directly, professional and pointed in ways that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing. They escaped to the balcony when formal requirements were satisfied, winter stars visible above the city despite light pollution, cold air sharp against skin. "We have 30 days to decide about the marriage bond," Lucian said quietly. "What do you want?" "I want you to choose freely," he replied, meeting her eyes directly. "No trials, no laws, no pressure. And if I choose yes, then we figure out what marriage between human and vampire king actually looks like. I suspect it won't resemble anything the council expects. And if I choose no, then I make sure you're protected anyway. The right stays even if the bond doesn't have to." Alara didn't respond immediately, the question too large for simple answer, too complicated by everything they had survived and everything they were building. But she took his hand, her bandaged palm against his cool skin, and they stood together watching city lights spread below them like constellation map, presence speaking what words couldn't yet articulate. The awareness between them was undeniable now. Not just physical attraction, but something deeper and more fundamental. Recognition of partnership that had formed under pressure and emerged stronger for it. 2 weeks passed in careful reconstruction of normal life, Elara moving into secure apartment owned by House Vale, but decorated to her preferences, hands healed enough to remove bandages and reveal faint scars across both palms that would remain permanently. She returned to museum work, colleagues wary but respectful in ways they hadn't been before, treating her opinions with weight they had previously dismissed, and the Ashford collection was seized by authorities with Alara consulting on provenance for pieces that might be returned to countries of origin. Lucian's visits became irregular but consistent pattern, appearing at closing time to walk her home through streets that felt safer with him present. Rare books delivered without fanfare when he discovered gaps in her personal library, research notes provided for obscure questions she had mentioned needing answers to during their conversations. They talked during these visits about subjects that had nothing to do with marriage or politics, discussing history and art and the loneliness of outliving everyone you cared about, compared to the invisibility of being systematically dismissed by people who should have known better. One evening, when rain drummed against library windows and fire burned low in the hearth, Alara asked about his maker with curiosity rather than judgment. "He believed humans were toys," Lucian said after long pause, choosing words carefully. "I believed they were people. That disagreement cost him his life and me centuries of trying to prove I was different." "You are different," Alara said with certainty that came from observation rather than flattery. "Because of people like you," he replied quietly, "who expect better." The first real kiss happened not during crisis or trial, but during quiet evening in his private library, rain creating rhythm against glass, talking about 12th century manuscript, and the scribe who had copied it with such care that individual letters showed personality. Lucian reached to turn the page at the same moment Alara did, their hands touching over parchment centuries old, and she didn't pull away when he looked at her with question in his expression. The kiss was slow and testing and real, no urgency driving it forward, just choice made deliberately by two people who had survived enough to know what they wanted. They pulled apart after a moment that stretched longer than either had intended, Lucian's expression showing something like wonder, ancient vampire who had seen centuries looking surprised by simple human intimacy. "We're really doing this," Alara said, statement rather than question, acknowledging the reality they were building. "Only if you want to," Lucian replied, giving her the choice he had promised from the beginning. "I want to," she said, and the certainty in her voice matched the certainty she had felt speaking truth into fire during the first trial. The 30-day deadline approached with weight. Both of them felt, but neither discussed directly. Marriage bond requiring formal ceremony, or explicit dissolution within legal timeframe. Alara spent hours researching vampire marriage customs and human legal requirements, trying to understand what she was agreeing to beyond symbolic gesture, what it meant to bind her life to someone who would outlive her by centuries. Lucian gave her space to think while remaining available when she needed to talk, walking the careful line between presence and pressure, between offering support and demanding decision. Sienna provided unexpected assistance during this time, appearing one afternoon at Alara's apartment with historical documents and pragmatic advice. "The bond is what you make it," she said bluntly. Traditional marriages were political arrangements between houses, modern marriages are partnerships. You get to define the terms. "What if I die and he doesn't?" Alara asked the question that had been haunting her research. "What happens to him?" Sienna's expression softened slightly. "The same thing that happens to any immortal who loses someone they love. He survives. He remembers. He continues. But that's true whether you marry him or not. The question isn't whether loss happens, it's whether the time together is worth it." Lady Mirren Hale visited separately, with warning disguised as wisdom, settling into Alara's small living room like ancient queen accepting temporary throne. "You will face opposition for the rest of your life," she said without preamble. "Traditional houses will see you as upstart. Modern vampires will see you as symbol. Humans will expect you to represent them. You will satisfy no one completely." Alara met her eyes directly. "I'm already familiar with satisfying no one. I've been doing it my entire academic career." Mirren's smile was sharp and approving. "Then you're better prepared than most. But understand this. Lucien has enemies who will use you to hurt him. Marriage makes you permanent target." "I became permanent target the moment he invoked the right," Alara replied. "Marriage just makes it official." "That's practical thinking," Mirren acknowledged. "You'll need it." The decision crystallized not during dramatic moment, but during ordinary evening, Lucien reading an armchair while Alara worked on provenance documentation at his library desk. Companionable silence, broken only by turning pages and occasional questions about historical context. She looked up from 16th century inventory list to find him watching her with expression that suggested he had been doing so for some time. "What?" she asked, and he shook his head slightly. "Just thinking about how different my life is now than it was 2 months ago." "Better or worse?" Alara asked, though his expression suggested she already knew the answer. "Impossibly better," he replied, "and terrifying for exactly that reason." She set down her pen and crossed to where he sat, taking the book from his hands and setting it aside, then sitting on the arm of his chair in position that was casual and intimate simultaneously. "I've made my decision about the marriage bond," she said quietly. His entire body went still, attention focused completely on her face. "And? I want to accept it, but I have conditions." He nodded slowly, expression carefully neutral. "Tell me." "We do this as equals," she said, ticking points off on scarred fingers. "I keep my work and my independence. You don't make decisions about my safety without consulting me first. We figure out the politics together instead of you protecting me from them. And if it stops working, if we realize we made a mistake, we have the option to end it without destroying each other." "Those are reasonable conditions," Lucien said carefully. "Do you agree to them?" Alara pressed, needing verbal confirmation. "I agree," he replied. "And I have one condition of my own." She raised eyebrow in question. "That you tell me if I'm failing to meet these conditions instead of suffering in silence." "I've spent a century in political relationships where honesty was weakness. I need you to be honest with me even when it's difficult." "I can do that," Ilara said, and she meant it, understood that the foundation they were building required truth, even when truth was uncomfortable. "Then we have an agreement," Lucien said, and his smile was genuine and unguarded in ways she had rarely seen. "We have a marriage," Ilara corrected, and kissed him to seal the arrangement. Kiss that was promise and beginning simultaneously. When they pulled apart, his hand came up to cup her face gently, thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "I will spend every day trying to be worthy of this choice," he said quietly. "You already are," she replied. "That's why I'm making it." The rain continued against the windows, and the fire burned low, and the decision was made. two people choosing each other despite the obstacles and because of the partnership they had built in fire and glass and blood. The museum felt different after hours when emptied of crowds and voices, hallways echoing with footsteps that seemed too loud in the silence, as Alara led Lucian through familiar corridors toward the private gallery where the 14th century reliquary stood spotlit in carefully controlled darkness. One day remained before the marriage bond must be formalized or dissolved according to covenant law, deadline approaching with weight that had pressed on both of them for weeks, despite their attempts to ignore the calendar's progression. The reliquary gleamed under museum lighting, gold and enamel work depicting saints and angels in poses of eternal prayer, the piece she had admired the night of the gala when everything had been performance and strategy rather than genuine feeling. "I've spent weeks thinking about what marriage means," Ilara began. The speech she had prepared and prepared again, finally spoken aloud in space, designed for preservation of history. Not the vampire law version, but the real version. Partnership, trust, choosing someone every day because they're worth it, not because law says so. "And?" Lucian asked quietly, standing very still as though movement might shatter whatever decision she had reached. She handed him folder containing legal documents drafted with Sienna's assistance and reviewed by three separate vampire law experts, papers establishing formal courtship contract that was vampire legal with 1-year term and mutual exit clauses, dissolving the automatic marriage bond before it formalized while creating new framework for their relationship. "I'm not ready for marriage," Alara said, watching his face for reaction. "Not yet, but I'm ready to try. Publicly. For real. I want to choose you. But I need time to know it's my choice, not the right's." Lucian's expression shifted through surprise and understanding before settling on something that looked like relief mixed with warmth that made him appear younger than his centuries. "You just rewrote vampire marriage law," he said, after long moments spent reading the contract's terms. "Good," Alara replied with a slight smile. "It needed editing. The kiss was different from the library kiss weeks before, carrying promise rather than question, certainty rather than exploration, and the reliquary's glass case, frosted over slightly, as residual vampire magic responded to emotional resonance in ways neither of them had intended or controlled. Within hours of filing the courtship contract with Covenant Records Office, the news spread through vampire social networks and human media outlets that covered supernatural politics, some houses approving the progressive modernization, while others called it insult to tradition that had governed vampire relationships for millennia. The Covenant itself was dividing along generational lines, younger vampires seeing the contract as natural evolution, while older houses viewed it as dangerous precedent that undermined social stability. 6 months passed in careful building of relationship that existed in public view, Ilara's career flourishing as she was offered directorship of International Ethics Board for Cultural Heritage, position that carried significant influence and visibility. She accepted despite Lucian's concerns about increased exposure, understanding that retreating from professional achievement, because of threats, would represent defeat more complete than any trial could accomplish. The letter arrived at her apartment on ordinary Tuesday afternoon, unmarked envelope containing single black rose and note written in elegant script that read, "The Ashfords send their regards. See you soon." Sienna's investigation team discovered that Victoria Ashford had been released from house arrest through legal technicality enabled by expensive lawyers, and surveillance footage showed her meeting with known vampire extremist groups, humans who believed vampires should return to traditional relationships with humanity that emphasized dominance and feeding rights rather than equality. The apartment break-in happened 3 days after the letter. Nothing stolen, but everything disturbed in violation that felt more personal than theft. Message clear in its simplicity about her lack of safety. Lucian wanted to move her to his estate immediately, offering protection of House Vale's security and centuries-old wards, But Alara refused with stubbornness born of principle rather than recklessness. I won't live in a cage, even a gilded one, she said during argument that stretched past midnight. Then I'm assigning permanent security, Lucian countered. Fine, Alara agreed. But I'm not changing my life because they're threatened by me existing. Their argument was heated but born of fear for each other rather than desire for control, both learning to navigate partnership under pressure that tested boundaries they were still establishing, and when anger faded, they held each other in silence that acknowledged the legitimate danger without surrendering to it. Sienna uncovered the extremist plot 2 weeks before scheduled public appearance. Intelligence gathered from multiple sources revealing plan to kidnap Alara during symposium on looted artifacts where she was keynote speaker, forcing Lucian to choose between invoking old vampire dominance laws to save her and destroying his reform credibility, or refusing and letting her die while appearing weak to both vampire and human observers. The timeline gave them 48 hours to decide response. Strategic meeting convened in Lucian's private study with Sienna and Lady Mirren, who had become unlikely ally after the trials. Options were limited and unsatisfying. Cancel the appearance and let extremists control her life through fear, provide heavy security that might provoke violence in crowd of academics and journalists, or use Alara as bait to catch them in the act with concealed security ready to intercept. Alara chose the third option before anyone else could speak. Tired of reactive positioning that let others define terms of engagement. They want to make me a victim again, she said with quiet intensity. I'm done being a victim. Lucian resisted immediately, the fear in his expression warring with understanding of her reasoning. I can't ask you to put yourself in danger. You're not asking, Alara replied. I'm choosing. The plan formation took hours of detailed discussion, Alara giving her speech while concealed security positioned throughout venue, Sienna's team ready to intercept at multiple points, but the risk remained real and acknowledged by everyone present that if timing failed, Alara could be hurt or killed before rescue arrived. Lady Mirren offered vampire resources for security detail, older vampires loyal to her personally rather than house politics, and Sienna coordinated with human law enforcement who had independent interest in stopping extremist group that threatened Covenant stability. The night before the symposium found Alara and Lucian in his library, unable to sleep despite exhaustion, sitting together in firelight and talking around the fear neither wanted to name directly. If something goes wrong tomorrow, Alara began, and Lucian interrupted before she could finish. Nothing will go wrong. But if it does, she continued, needing to say words that might not get another chance for speaking. You need to know. I love you. Not because of the right or the bond or any law. I love you because of who you are, what you've built, what you fought for, what you refuse to compromise. Silence stretched between them, heavy with emotion and unspoken fears before Lucian responded with honesty that matched hers. I love you because you see me as I am, not what I've been. And you expect me to be better anyway. The kiss was deep and desperate and real, promise and goodbye contained in single moment just in case tomorrow brought the worst outcome they were both imagining, and when they finally separated, neither moved away, staying close in physical contact that provided comfort against approaching danger. They talked through the night about everything except the symposium, sharing stories and memories and hopes for future that might not happen, building connection that transcended the immediate threat. Lucian told her about the first human he had befriended after leaving his maker, woman who had run bookshop in 19th century Paris and treated him like person rather than monster, how her death from illness had nearly broken him, but also taught him that mortal friendships were worth the inevitable loss. Alara described her childhood fascination with museums, how she would spend hours studying single artifacts and imagining the people who had made them, used them, loved them enough to preserve them through centuries. We're both drawn to things that last, Lucian observed quietly. Maybe that's why we found each other. Or maybe we're learning that some things last because we choose to preserve them, Alara replied, hand finding his in the darkness. Not because they're immortal, but because they matter enough to fight for. Dawn approached too quickly, gray light filtering through library windows, and they prepared for the symposium with careful attention to detail that masked underlying tension, Alara choosing clothing that was professional and unrestricting for movement, Lucian reviewing security positions one final time with Sienna, who projected confidence neither of them fully felt. The symposium venue filled with academics and journalists and cultural heritage professionals, exactly the audience Ilara had hoped to reach with her keynote on ethical frameworks for artifact repatriation. People who cared about history and preservation and doing right by cultures whose heritage had been stolen. Security was invisible but present. Sienna's team scattered through crowd in positions that allowed quick response, Lady Mirren's vampires stationed at exits and in adjoining rooms, human law enforcement outside in unmarked vehicles. Lucian sat in third row where Alara could see him if she needed visual anchor, his expression carefully neutral, despite the fear she knew he felt. Her speech began with analysis of specific cases where artifacts had been returned to countries of origin, discussing legal frameworks and ethical considerations, and practical challenges of authentication and transportation. 20 minutes in, she saw the first sign of trouble. Man near back exit standing when others sat, hand moving toward jacket pocket in motion that security training had taught her to recognize. She continued speaking without pause, trusting the plan they had made, and Sienna's team moved before the man could complete whatever action he had intended, silent interception that removed him from venue without disrupting presentation. 2 more attempts followed at carefully spaced intervals, coordinated assault designed to overwhelm security through multiple simultaneous threats, but each was countered by positioning they had anticipated and planned for specifically. The final attempt came during question period when woman stood to ask about provenance standards, her question turning into accusation about Ilara's relationship with Lucian, undermining her professional credibility. Distraction technique meant to occupy attention while Confederates moved into position. Ilara answered the accusation directly and publicly, explaining the courtship contract and her deliberate choice to maintain professional independence, using the attack as opportunity to demonstrate exactly the principles she had been defending, and the audience response was overwhelmingly supportive, in ways that clearly surprised the extremists. Security closed in during the applause, apprehending remaining conspirators before violence could escalate, and Victoria Ashford was found in vehicle outside coordinating the operation through encrypted communications that Sienna's technical team had been monitoring throughout the event. The symposium concluded with standing ovation that felt like vindication, academics and professionals affirming support for both her work and her right to personal life without compromise. And when Ilara left the stage, Lucian was waiting with expression that showed relief and pride and love that needed no words to communicate. The university lecture hall held 300 attendees seated in tiered rows designed for optimal acoustics. Scholars and journalists and cultural heritage professionals gathered to hear Ilara speak on ethical frameworks for returning stolen artifacts to source communities. She stood at the podium with notes prepared but barely referenced, her arguments sharp and researched and passionate in ways that held the audience in rapt attention, discussing specific cases and legal precedents and moral imperatives that transcended simple questions of ownership. Lucian sat in the front row where she could see him if needed, his presence both comfort and reminder of what they had survived together, while Sienna's security team scattered throughout the hall in positions that appeared casual but allowed rapid response to threats. 30 minutes into the presentation, 3 audience members stood simultaneously in coordinated movement that was too precise to be coincidence, and Ilara saw the weapons before they spoke. Modern firearms designed to threaten both humans and vampires with ammunition that could kill or incapacitate either species. Dr. Moss, the leader said with voice that projected artificial confidence over underlying nervousness. You're coming with us. No one interferes or we start shooting. Alara's response followed the plan they had rehearsed, not freezing but stepping back from the podium with hands raised while positioning herself near the emergency exit where Sienna's team maintained coverage, and her voice was steady when she spoke. If you want to talk about vampire-human relations, we can do that here. I've survived worse threats than you. The standoff stretched through tense seconds while audience members began to understand the danger, some ducking below seats while others remained frozen in shock. And Lucian stood with movement that was slow and deliberate, his presence filling the room as ancient power barely contained by choice, became visible in ways that transcended physical size. You have 3 seconds to put down your weapons and leave, he said quietly, peacefully. The leader's nervousness increased despite attempts to hide it, weapon trembling slightly in hand that had probably never fired at living target. We're not afraid of you. You should be, Lucian replied, and the absolute certainty in his voice made the threat more terrifying for its understatement. Sienna's team closed in from multiple angles with professional precision, movements coordinated through silent communication, and 2 attackers surrendered immediately when they understood how thoroughly outmaneuvered they were. But the leader fired in panic rather than calculation. Bullet aimed not at Alara, but at Lucian in attempt to provoke the violence they had planned to exploit. Lucian moved faster than human eye could track, vampire speed putting him between Alara and the projectile in fraction of second, and the bullet hit him in shoulder rather than intended target. Silver ammunition designed to slow vampire healing and cause maximum damage. Sienna disarmed the shooter in seconds with technique that was brutally efficient, breaking the hand that held weapon while sweeping legs to bring the attacker down hard against floor. And security personnel flooded into the hall to restrain all 3 conspirators before situation could escalate further. The medical crisis was contained but serious, Silver needing extraction before Lucian's natural healing could begin working on damaged tissue, and Alara helped despite hands that shook with adrenaline reaction, her museum work with preservation chemistry providing knowledge of how to neutralize silver compounds using materials available in university medical supplies. They worked in small office converted to temporary treatment space. Alara's fingers steady once she began the actual procedure, despite fear that threatened to overwhelm concentration, and their faces were inches apart as she carefully extracted the bullet and applied neutralizing agent to wound that was already showing signs of infection from silver toxicity. You said you were tired of watching the defenseless get hurt, Alara said quietly while working. But you're not invincible. I know, Lucian replied through gritted teeth, pain making his voice rough but not diminishing the intensity of his focus on her face. That's why I have you. The investigation results came quickly once authorities interrogated the captured attackers and traced their funding, discovering that extremist group had been financed by Victoria Ashford and remnants of House Thorne, an alliance between humans and vampires who wanted old order restored regardless of cost to individuals caught in their political maneuvering. Legal consequences followed swiftly through both human and vampire justice systems. Victoria Ashford facing decades in prison for conspiracy and attempted murder, while House Thorne was formally dissolved by Covenant Council, its members absorbed into other houses or exiled from vampire society entirely depending on their level of involvement in extremist activities. The attack backfired spectacularly on those who had planned it, public sympathy swinging strongly toward Alara and Lucian as their relationship became symbol of progressive change, partnership over dominance, and the kind of transformation that threatened traditional power structures precisely because it worked. Covenant reform accelerated in response to public pressure and internal advocacy, Lady Myron and younger council members pushing successfully for formal abolition of trial of worth and reformation of right of shielding to make protection available without marriage requirement, genuine mutual consent with mandatory waiting period, ensuring that desperation could not force permanent bonds. 6 weeks after the symposium attack found Lucian and Alara in his library, discussing practical matters, her apartment lease ending, and decisions needed about next steps in relationship that had already survived more challenges than most marriages faced in decades. The proposal was not grand or public spectacle, but private moment between two people who understood exactly what they were choosing. Firelight casting shadows on walls lined with books that had witnessed their growing intimacy over months of careful relationship building. Our courtship contract has 6 months remaining, Lucian began carefully. We could extend it. Or, he handed her ring that was not ornate or ostentatious, but simple silver band with inscription in the language of the rite. Words that read, "Choice not obligation," in script so small it required close examination to decipher. Or we could acknowledge what we both already know. I want to marry you, not because law requires it, because I choose you. Every day. Will you marry me? Yes, Alara answered without hesitation, certainty absolute in ways that transcended fear or doubt. On one condition. Name it, Lucian said, already smiling because he knew her well enough to anticipate the nature of her request. We write our own vows, she explained. In English. None of this ancient language obligation poetry. Just us promising what we actually mean. Deal, he agreed, and his smile was rare and genuine and transforming in ways that made him appear young, despite centuries of accumulated experience. The wedding took place 1 year after their first meeting at the museum gala. Small ceremony held in the same gallery where wine had been spilled and reputations threatened, mixture of vampire and human guests, gathered to witness union that represented personal choice and political statement simultaneously. Lady Mirren officiated with gravity appropriate to moment significance, ancient vampire lending her authority to ceremony that deliberately rejected many traditional elements in favor of authenticity over pageantry. Their vows were simple and honest, Lucian promising to choose her every day even when difficult, to protect without caging, to love as she was rather than who he might want her to be, while Ilara promised to expect better from him always, to stand beside rather than behind, to build something new together, even when old ways fought back against change. The exchange of rings happened in silence, heavy with emotion, silver bands marked with inscriptions they had written for each other, private words meant only for them regardless of witnesses present. The reception took place in Museum Garden as evening deepened into night, Ilara and Lucian dancing under strings of lights, while around them vampire and human guests mingled in conversation and laughter, old divisions still present but cracking under weight of demonstrated possibility. Her hand fit perfectly in his, despite temperature difference between living warmth and undead coolness, her head resting on his shoulder in position that was comfortable and trusting, and spoke to intimacy, built through shared survival rather than romantic fantasy. They ruined my dress at a gala and accidentally gave me a kingdom, Ilara thought, while moving through simple dance steps that required no particular skill. Not the vampire kind, but the kind you build yourself, choice by choice and day by day, the kind that cannot be taken away, but only shared with those who prove themselves worthy of the offering. Through the window, observers could see them dancing against backdrop of garden lights and gathering darkness, image of partnership that transcended species differences and political complications, and the view pulled back to show city beyond, with lights coming on as dusk fell, vampire and human worlds overlapping in ways that promised integration rather than separation. 6 months after the wedding, Ilara's International Ethics Board successfully repatriated 40,000 stolen artifacts to countries of origin, work that continued the mission she had begun as junior researcher and now led with authority earned through demonstrated expertise and unwillingness to compromise principles for convenience. Lucian's covenant reforms passed with 60% council approval, significant majority that represented generational shift in vampire politics, and acknowledgement that old systems required updating to remain relevant in changing world. House Vale and the Moss Foundation announced joint venture establishing museum dedicated to accurate vampire human history, project that would take years to complete, but promised to challenge narratives that both species had accepted without examination for too long. The Museum Planning Committee met monthly in conference room that had once hosted vampire court sessions, scholars and vampires working together to design exhibits that told complicated truths rather than comfortable lies. And Alara chaired these meetings with confidence that came from knowing she had survived worse than academic disagreements about curatorial choices. Lucian attended when council business permitted, offering historical perspective from someone who had lived through events that others only studied from documents. And his contributions were valued by team that had learned to see past the vampire king to the individual who cared deeply about accurate representation of past. They were still married in ways that surprised people who had predicted their relationship would collapse under pressure of public scrutiny and political opposition. Partnership deepening rather than fragmenting as they learned to navigate challenges together instead of separately. Evening walks through city streets became routine rather than special occasion, conversation flowing easily about work and politics, and small domestic details that accumulated into shared life, and sometimes they still visited the museum after hours, to stand before the reliquary where they had first acknowledged feelings that law and circumstance had complicated but never truly controlled. The glass case no longer frosted in response to vampire magic, because Lucien had learned to control emotional resonance that affected physical environment. But the memory of that first kiss remained vivid for both of them, reminder of beginning that had led to everything they had built. They chose each other daily, in ways both grand and mundane, choosing partnership over independence, trust over protection, growth over comfort, and the city around them changed slowly in response to example they set, without necessarily intending to become symbols of anything beyond their own commitment. Other vampires began establishing courtship contracts rather than invoking automatic marriage bonds, younger generation embracing model that allowed genuine consent and personal choice, while human attitudes toward vampires shifted incrementally toward acceptance that individual vampires could be judged on actions rather than species. The work continued because transformation was never single moment, but accumulation of countless small decisions made over years and decades. And Alara and Lucian understood better than most that the choice to build something new required daily recommitment to principles that others would challenge constantly. But they had survived trials designed to break them, attacks meant to destroy them, and politics intended to separate them. And they knew with certainty, earned through experience, that what they had built together was strong enough to withstand whatever challenges the future brought.